What do we know empirically about media and terrorism? What role does media and media institutions and personalities therein play in terrorism and counterterrorism? How are public understandings of what terrorism is and how we must stop it influenced by mass media? Can media promote terrorism? Does media help to prevent terrorism? If so, how? On this episode, we're talking about terrorism and media. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's get to it. My name is Dr. Derek Silva, and I'm a criminologist studying discourses related to terrorism and practices associated with counterterrorism. And this episode is all about the role that media as an institution and media personalities therein have in constructing, producing and reproducing, maintaining and promulgating cultural ideas about terrorism, counterterrorism, and the host of practices associated with both. Before we begin, there are a few important terms that must be operationalized for our use in this video. Media is a generic term meaning all the methods or channels for the exchange of information, cultural imagery, and entertainment. Mass media simply refers to all of the modes of communication that are intended to reach a mass audience. It is the primary means of communication used to reach a vast majority of the general public. The most common platforms for mass media are newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and the internet. The late 20th century has seen the globalization of the mass media culture. But we should not overlook the fact that throughout history, informal methods of communication such as gossip, in the taverns and streets or in marketplaces, have been the standard of local media for transmitting information. And these informal channels coexist with all of the latest multimedia technology in contemporary societies. In fact, some of the more informal methods of communication have been completely replaced by the rise of social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Snapchat. Indeed, the convenience, affordability, and broad reach of social media platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram, and Instagram, terrorist groups and individuals have increasingly used social media to further their goals, recruit members, and spread their messages. Attempts have been made by various governments and agencies to prevent or manage the use of social media by terrorist organizations in a variety of different ways that we'll explore in this video. In the early debates about the role of media in terrorism, the key argument centered on sort of two schools. One, on scholars who believe that terrorism and media are completely disconnected social phenomena, that they are not related at all to one another. And two, those that argue that terrorism and media have formed a symbiotic relationship, a mutual relationship of closely associated phenomena that in some ways enable one another. In his 1993 book, The Making of Terrorism, French sociologist Michael Wiviacora attempts to dismiss the claim that terrorism and the media are in a symbiotic relationship. He argues that there are four distinct relationships between supposed terrorists and the media. The first of these is described as one of pure indifference, when the terrorist groups neither seek to frighten a given population group beyond their intended victims, nor to realize a propaganda coup through their acts. But since terrorism is itself most often defined by its attempts to intimidate and frighten the masses through violence, this category is actually not that relevant because, as we can see empirically, terrorists and terrorist groups almost always rely on media in some way when they undertake their political violence. The second relational mode is that of relative indifference, in which perpetrators of violence remain indifferent about making the headlines, not out of disrespect with regard to the most powerful media, but because there already exist channels of communication through which to discuss and explain their positions. The kind of channels which he lists which already exist are a legal and relatively free press. For example, radio transmitters and centers for free expression such as universities, churches, and mosques. But what are these channels that already exist, if not alternative forms of media, even if informal? And do we know how many cases where these channels have been used over sources like the free press? One might also add the internet and social media, now widely used by terrorist groups. But are those themselves not media? Wiviacor's third relational mode, the media-oriented strategy, is relatively self-explanatory, where those committing terrorist activities actively use media as a core feature of their strategy. This can cover terrorist efforts to provoke the media into action, or as a, quote, calculated manipulation of what they know of media operations. But this type seems to only approach the relationship between media and those committing terrorist activity as an instrumental one, as only the individual or groups committing terrorism can influence or manipulate media, not the other way around. This misses how media latently produces and reinforces messages of intimidation and threat simply by virtue of covering the violence. Certainly, media can be used as an instrument to disseminate the messages of threat and intimidation, but it also may not be used instrumentally by these groups. In other words, media and media institutions themselves may be instilling fear and terror themselves simply by covering it. This applies equally to Wiviacor's fourth relational mode, which he terms a total break, which I think is more accurately described as coercion of media. Wiviacor is simply referring to cases where those committing terrorist activity come to view media organizations, editors, journalists, and broadcasters as enemies to be punished and destroyed, as part of the system in which they seek to destroy. Those on the other side of the debate argue that the relationship between media and terrorism is much more symbiotic, that we cannot understand terrorism and terrorist activity without understanding the role that media play in it. Some have called this a problem of communications, that although terrorism has remained remarkably ineffective as a tool for toppling governments or capturing political power, it has been incredibly successful at promoting and disseminating political messages and relaying the overall terrorist threat to a much wider audience. In other words, while historically evidence clearly demonstrates that terrorism is not an effective way of actually achieving their goals of gaining political power, it is very successful in publicizing political causes. Think of when, where, and how you hear about terrorism, people engaging in terrorist activities, their motives, life course, and ideologies. I bet it isn't from reading government threat assessments. I imagine most, if not all of you, hear about terrorism, supposed terrorist plots, and those who commit it from mass media of some kind. For terrorism scholars in many circles, terrorism is inherently a psychological weapon which depends on the communication of threat to the public. Without threat and intimidation attempts, terrorism may not even exist because it is a central feature in how we choose to define terrorism as opposed to something like murder. And while the media certainly do not represent or condone terrorism, political violence, or the views of most terrorist organizations, media exist within a fiercely competitive market for ideas and attention, only becoming more competitive with the rise of social media, and therefore feel pressed to be the first to the story and to provide more information, more breaking news, and more entertainment for viewers. They are therefore almost necessitated to cover terrorist activities and respond to terrorist propaganda and messages because of its newsworthy features. The interconnections between media and terrorism are thus said to reflect, from this perspective, a symbiotic relationship. Not that mass media are controlled by or part of terrorist organizations, but that media are constantly challenged by attempts to manipulate and exploit their coverage by those engaging in terrorism to serve their own ends. In some ways, those engaging in terrorism have been quite successful in using media to serve their goals. And this problem highlights the importance of ensuring that media institutions and professionals are responsible, educated, and trained to deal with these attempts as a matter of public concern and public policy rather than solely about journalistic ethics. Indeed, as Jeffrey Ian Ross suggests, because the news media in particular are extremely powerful actors in the context of terrorism, any understanding of the connections between this type of violence and media must be embedded in broader discussions of political power of the media itself, especially in the context of conflict situations. We must empirically explore the relationship between journalists, editors, and terrorists, and the connection between terrorism and public opinion. Media has the ability to affect public opinion and policy alike. One example from the supplementary readings for this week is the emergence and development of post-9/11 counter-terrorism discourses in media centered on notions of this so-called radicalization process. In the supplementary reading, I hold that it is important to examine the formation and transformation of cultural representations of radicalization because of their potential to influence popular understandings of terrorism-related phenomena and government counter-terrorism policies. The purpose of this study was to examine national news coverage related to radicalization in the United States news media. I used what's called discourse analysis of over 600 articles published in the New York Times to offer insight into how media defines the term, and equally important to the analysis, how it is constitutive of and constructed by the social world. Drawing on the Orientalism framework developed by Edward Said that we talked about in topic 3, I argue that the producers of radicalization discourses employ strategic discursive mechanisms to treat Muslims as the subject of negativized radicalization narratives, thereby positioning Islam in direct opposition to the West and the supposed Western ideals. As you'll recall, in this article, the West is derived from Said's notion of Occident, which generally distinguishes cultures and geographical areas of the Americas, Oceania, and most of Europe from Islamic cultures of the Middle East and Asia. I also advance the established idea that news media representations of radicalization increasingly deploy religion as a symbolic marker for economic and political conflicts between the Middle East and the so-called West. Considerable scholarly attention has been paid to negativize media portrayals of Muslim populations. Researchers have pointed out that representations of Muslims in Western media are often associated with violence and conflict, most notably terrorism. While this is not a distinctly new trend or finding, Muslims continue to be negativized by Western media, particularly since the events of 9/11. Importantly, scholars have noted that US media accounts of terrorism employ linguistic strategies to ignore violence committed by quote-unquote us, and rather focus on violence and negative behavior of quote-unquote them. Make no mistake, the othering paradigm traced back to Said's work has been quite influential in analyses of media discourse, particularly so in explorations of how religious communities are represented within media. In this piece, I documented how producers of radicalization discourses in the media have increasingly focused on Islam, and they do so in spite of relatively low threat posed by so-called Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. Since the 1970s, the number of terrorist attacks in the US and the UK have dropped, while the threat of terrorism in Canada has remained very low. Several scholars, such as Charles Kurzman and Gary Lafree, have demonstrated that the risk of Islamic-related terrorism is at least equal to that posed by the far right. According to the FBI, 94% of terrorist attacks carried out in the US from 1980 to 2005 were perpetrated by individuals with no association to Islam at all. According to Europol, the European equivalent to Interpol, less than 2% of terrorist attacks in the European Union from 2009 to 2013 were what they classified as religiously motivated. In Canada, of the 74 recorded terrorist attacks included in the University of Maryland's Global Terrorism Database, 5 have been carried out by individuals associated with Islam, which accounts for 6.8% of all terrorist attacks in Canada. Most other attacks have been carried out by nationalist or environmental groups, yet the data suggests that notions of radicalization are not deployed by the media in those cases. This leads to the question of why we do not evoke ideas in cases of far-right extremism or incel-related violence, such as the cases of Dylan Roof in Charleston or Alec Manassian here in Canada. This study illustrates how radicalization discourse has emerged as a principal framework by which we make sense of terrorist activity. Rather than contributing to narratives about the causes of terrorism in terms of criminal activity or military conflict, 21st century news media constructs radicalization as one of the fundamental explanatory frameworks for understanding individual and group processes that culminate in terrorism. While more research must be conducted on this particular phenomenon, exploring how media increasingly connects radicalization to terrorism rather than other forms of deviance, would contribute an understanding of how we conceptualize terrorism as a specific form of religiously motivated political violence that can be understood through reference to radicalization. Finally, the emergence of radicalization as a precursor to domestic terrorism in media portrayals also developed in a way congruent with the othering perspective, and contributed to narratives that position Muslims in the West in direct opposition to dominant cultural systems. The news media employed backgrounding strategies to construct American Muslim citizens as subjects of radicalization, and used the construct to make sense of a transition towards extremist beliefs premised on particular religious affiliations. The findings are suggestive of the media's differential treatment of Muslims in its accounts of radicalization. In terms of news media discourses about radicalization, Muslims, both in America and elsewhere, are constructed as a threat to the Western world by virtue of their religious belief systems, which may then contribute to a collective understanding of subjects of radicalization solely in terms of religious affiliation, rather than a process that can affect anyone, regardless of cultural or ideological background. This study offers an empirical basis for which this idea can be further investigated and explained, and thus future areas for research. In Chris Bale's The Fringe Effect, the Duke professor uses cultural sociologist John Moore's idea of discursive fields, defined here as dynamic terrains where meaning contests occur, and define the limits of discussion on a particular issue. In other words, he aims to sketch out the battlegrounds where collective actors compete to give meaning to an issue, an interaction where media take on a very primary and fundamental role. What Chris Bale did was trace out the discursive field where different actors compete to give meaning to post-9/11 terrorism. He explored all of the quote-unquote meaning contests in which different actors sought to give the dominant meaning to issues related to terrorism and counterterrorism. Also important here is how Bale was able to use the sociological concept of discursive field to differentiate between so-called mainstream and fringe narratives about terrorism. Mainstream narratives are defined as those that regularly deploy one of the most common frames within a discursive field at any given time. Fringe narratives, on the other hand, are those that regularly deploy one of the least popular frames, and thus remain on the sort of edges or the fringes of mainstream discourse. The use of mainstream is not to be confused with discourses that regularly receive coverage or to describe powerful media outlets or politicians themselves. Here it simply describes the representativeness of a stakeholder's frame vis-a-vis the broader discursive field. This distinction is critical because it enables one to determine whether scholars or politicians or civil society organizations, or in our case media, influence a discursive field by deploying mainstream frames, or if they become part of the mainstream precisely because they are receiving coverage. Bale found that fringe narratives and civil society organizations presenting anti-Muslim rhetoric that were not part of the mainstream discourse at the time captivated media in the post-9/11 context via displays of fear and anger, even though the majority of organizations influencing media at the time did not present such views. By 2010, these fringe narratives not only permeated the mainstream, but also forged vast social networks amongst media that consolidated their capacity to create relatively more cultural change than others. In other words, less influential, smaller, and less well-resourced anti-Muslim civil society organizations were able to work themselves from the fringe of mainstream coverage to the mainstream through a variety of social psychological processes, and therefore overtake original mainstream organizations that did not share the anti-Muslim sentiment. Bale's work in many ways represents some of the most groundbreaking empirical work in the field that highlights how certain groups win meaning contests and become more influential in the public domain. Social media has also been found to be a key factor in the so-called radicalization process that drives certain folks to commit political violence. It has in many ways changed the game as it relates to terrorism and made it much more challenging to prevent, stop, or manage terrorism, as it spans the globalized world and not just geographically, but also virtually. Social media, understood as platforms where users can share ideas, thoughts, information, and beliefs through online and virtual networks and communities like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, has radically changed the ways in which we access, make sense of, understand, and consume information that in some ways shape our own opinions. Scholars have thus demonstrated the need for understanding how social media has impacted the ways in which we consume or avoid consuming certain media, particularly in the context of news media, which frame our connections to reality in a variety of ways. Indeed, a recent study published in Science actually found that fake news is able to travel through the Twitter network much faster than real news. Another study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Sinelli and colleagues showed that online uptake and dissemination of news on Facebook is driven largely by homophily in interaction networks, based on bias in the information towards like-minded groups. In other words, this research found that if a Facebook social network is characterized by a high degree of homophily, or the tendency for people to have ties with people who are similar to themselves demographically, ideologically, politically, and so on, the aggregation of clusters dominate online interactions. They drive the narrative and influence the network as a whole. In social scientific circles, this phenomenon is called an echo chamber. Echo chambers, broadly defined as environments in which the opinion, political ideology, or belief of users about a given topic is reinforced due to repeated interactions and exposure with peers or like-minded sources that have similar tendencies, attitudes, and beliefs. Selective exposure of information sources and confirmation bias, or the tendency to seek out information that only confirms presupposed beliefs, have been linked with the emergence of echo chambers on social media. Studies have explored the echo chamber phenomenon in a number of contexts, from the dissemination of information by ISIS and sympathizers on Twitter to the massive rise in right-wing populism across much of the world that has importantly given rise to increased political violence, like we saw on January 6th in Washington, D.C. But as documented by Boulian and colleagues, the rise of populism is commonly viewed as one of the most important problems challenging democracy across the world. Many observers, especially journalists, have suggested that the spread and effectiveness of populist movements have been aided by social media and the echo chambers that it promotes. There are a number of plausible links between social media and populism of all varieties, such as the role of social media as tools for mobilization, the structure of the platform itself that favors like-mindedness and homophily, the social media's facilitation of in-group communication and out-group demonization, the content of political communication, and the ability to bypass mainstream news media and communicate directly with the masses. These features, in some ways unique to social media, fuel political polarization that lays the foundation for the emergence of echo chambers over time, that further increase that polarization and in extreme cases supports terrorism directly. But does the echo chamber hypothesis, that as echo chambers emerge, folks are subsumed by the narrative and brought into extremist groups that further fuel extremist beliefs, make any sense at all? Is it a legitimate hypothesis? Well, Boulian and colleagues found that there's little evidence that social media can explain support for right-wing populist candidates and parties regardless of the notable and vast echo chambers that they identified. They also found that offline discussion in homophilous contexts positively correlated with the support for populist candidates in the UK and France, suggesting that online social media may not be the main driver of the rise of right-wing populism, which has been shown elsewhere as being associated with right-wing extremist violence. On the surface, these are some really interesting findings. One would suspect that as folks cluster into echo chambers of like-minded networks, they would increasingly adopt those views and ultimately try to influence political life. While this is indeed true, this particular study suggests that exclusive discussion with like-minded others through social media is not associated with support for right-wing populists in any of the three countries analyzed. This challenges popular impressions of the connection between social media echo chambers and right-wing populism. Interesting indeed from a sociological viewpoint, but importantly, The study was not designed to examine political recruitment and organizing through social media by populist parties, candidates, and groups. It was also not designed to examine problems of falsehoods and propaganda more generally. The effects of social media that trail into the so-called real world were not fully enveloped in the study at all. In other words, the study highlights how social media cannot alone be understood as the sole driver of polarization and so-called radicalization of right-wing views. So what are the effects of social media then? How can we measure the impact that social media has on the emergence of more extremist views? Well, Ryan Scrivens, who we'll read later on in the course as well, has shown how echo chambers on the right-wing website Stormfront have worked to quote-unquote radicalize folks in the online space and mobilize them to take their virtual hate into the so-called real world. The emergence of online spaces of hate on places like Stormfront bleed over to places like Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and create social networks that span both virtual and so-called real-world environments that construct and reinforce homophilous communities of shared beliefs, ideologies, thoughts, and demographics. These communities often continue to increase their polarization and increase their demonization of outgroups through engagement with the echo chamber, both online and in virtual spaces. In this way, Scrivens and others have documented how there are spillover effects to virtual echo chambers that increasingly move the online space to the offline. Others have linked this to the rise of right-wing extremism and political violence perpetrated by right-wing nationalist and neo-Nazi groups that in many ways culminated in the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol. Let me be clear, this entire field is absolutely ripe for sociological study. There is so much that has yet to be fully understood in the context of online and offline polarization, and how echo chambers reinforce and promote extremist ideals and ultimately violence. There are so many social scientific projects here, and I can't even begin to describe how important this will be in the future. And as you can see by the accompanying course videos, private corporations like Facebook and Twitter are increasingly looking to data scientists, sociologists, criminologists, and other social scientists to understand how their platforms contribute to polarization and ultimately to violence. This really is something that all students in sociology and in criminology should pay attention to. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something about the role of media in terrorism, counterterrorism, and the proliferation of terrorist communications. I also hope you learned something about how media can actually promote some of the forms of political polarization that may at some point ultimately lead to violence. It is incredibly important that we ensure that our media institutions have the tools, resources, and education to not only prevent being manipulated, but also that they are accountable for how they represent and make sense of terrorism-related phenomena in potentially problematic ways. This has been Professor Silva, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Sociology of Terrorism.